The car jerked to a stop on the gravel shoulder, the tires grinding against loose stones and sending a dull vibration through the seat beneath me. I looked up from the window, expecting a flat tire or an engine issue, but the road around us was empty. Just dry fields stretching out under a gray sky. My nephew's hands tightened on the steering wheel before he turned toward me with a look I hadn't seen before. He pulled a stack of papers from the console and shoved them into my lap. "Sign it, or I'll leave you here," he said, his voice low and stripped of anything familiar. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at him, searching his face for some sign this was a mistake, some hint of frustration rather than threat. His expression didn't change. The sharpness in his eyes made something cold move through my chest, and the silence inside the car felt too close, as if the air itself had pulled back. I picked up the papers slowly, my fingers brushing across the edges. They weren't just forms. They were something he wanted, something he wasn't willing to ask for anymore. The fields around us were empty. No houses, no traffic, no witnesses. My nephew stepped out of the car, circling to my door and pulling it open before I could process what he intended. The wind was sharp against my face as he leaned in, pointing at the signature line with a quick, impatient jab. His tone grew harder, more urgent. The calmness gone. I felt the weight of my age in my joints as I placed a hand on the doorframe, steadying myself, trying to buy time without showing fear. But the threat didn't need repeating. It was plain, direct, and real. As I stood there holding the papers, a faint crunch of footsteps sounded from behind us. A man walking his dog along the gravel path slowed down, watching the scene with a cautious eye. He hesitated, then approached a few steps closer, stopping far enough not to intrude, but close enough to understand something wasn't right. My nephew stiffened at the sight of him, shifting his stance and forcing a tight smile. I felt a flicker of relief, just enough to steady my breathing without changing the tension. The stranger asked if everything was all right, his voice steady but careful. I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure what I was allowed to say. My nephew stepped in, telling him we were fine, dismissing him with a forced laugh that didn't match his eyes. The stranger didn't move. He looked at the papers still in my hand, then at my nephew, then back at me. Something in my face must have told him the truth, not the details, the unease. He asked if he could take a look at the pages. My nephew tried to cut him off, saying it was private insurance paperwork, nothing important. The stranger ignored the interruption and took the top sheet when I offered it, without speaking. He scanned the text quickly, his jaw tightening in small increments that were easy to miss unless you were watching closely. Then he lifted his eyes to mine and leaned in just enough that only I could hear him. "Sir, this is illegal." The words weren't dramatic. They were quiet, factual, spoken with the kind of certainty a man uses when he knows trouble when he sees it. My nephew's face changed instantly, a flash of tension crossing his features before he caught himself. He stepped forward, trying to reclaim control of the moment, insisting that everything was a misunderstanding. His voice was calm but too sharp around the edges, the kind of tone people use when they're building a wall around a lie. The papers shook slightly in my hand, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity that settled over me. Whatever this was, it wasn't an argument or a miscommunication. It was a line being crossed in broad daylight, right in front of a stranger who happened to arrive at the worst possible moment for my nephew. And for the first time, I understood I wasn't just being pressured. I was in danger. After my wife passed, the house grew quiet in a way I hadn't expected. Her illness had taken months, and during that time, every room held the sound of machines, medication schedules, and the soft effort of trying to keep her comfortable. When all of that stopped, the silence felt heavier than the grief itself. I woke up each morning still listening for her voice, still waiting for the small routines we once shared. Days stretched long without structure, and I moved through them with the slow, uncertain steps of someone learning to live alone again. It was during those months of fog that my nephew began stopping by more often. He said he wanted to help with errands, drive me to appointments, or pick up groceries so I wouldn't have to leave the house. At first, I accepted it gratefully. I told myself he was stepping up because he cared, because family fills the gaps when life falls apart. He was cheerful then, always quick to smile, always ready to point out how much simpler things would be if I let him shoulder a few tasks. I didn't question his eagerness. Grief makes you thankful for any presence that breaks the quiet. But even in those early visits, There were signs I didn't recognize for what they were. He started glancing at the bills on my desk, longer than necessary, asking how much certain medications had cost or whether I had considered selling the spare car. He'd mention his own expenses almost casually, slipping in comments about rent rising or an unexpected repair he couldn't afford. Each remark was framed as conversation, not complaint, yet something about the timing felt oddly precise. Still, I assumed he was simply overwhelmed by his own life and needed someone to talk to. When I handed him small amounts of money for errands, he stopped giving me change, unless I asked. He began rounding up totals or adding items I hadn't listed, explaining that the store had run out of cheaper options. I let it go, telling myself the difference didn't matter. It was easier than examining why these small inconsistencies started bothering me. I didn't want to admit that his generosity had come with a shadow I couldn't quite name. Over time, his involvement in my daily life grew deeper than I realized. He started picking up my mail without asking, saying he passed the box on his way in and might as well grab it. He restacked papers on my counter when I wasn't looking, sorting them into piles he thought made more sense. He'd comment on my bank envelopes, noting which ones seemed important, even though I don't remember showing him which accounts were which. Everything he did was dressed as help, and I accepted it because it filled the empty hours with movement. Looking back, the earliest red flags weren't dramatic. They were small moments. Questions asked too quickly, glances held a little too long, decisions made on my behalf without being offered to me first. I brushed them aside because I didn't want to believe anyone in my family would take advantage of the space grief carved out inside me. It was easier to think I misunderstood than to consider that his eagerness to help had another purpose. As the month settled into a routine, something in me grew uneasy whenever he arrived unannounced. I couldn't place the feeling then, but there was a distance in his tone that hadn't existed before, a sense that he wasn't visiting out of affection, but out of expectation. The help he offered came with an invisible thread tied to every gesture. I told myself trust was the glue of family, that I shouldn't question someone who claimed to care. But a quiet doubt lingered beneath the surface, subtle and persistent. And for the first time, I wondered if I had placed that trust in the wrong hands. My nephew showed up one afternoon, carrying a thin stack of papers and a pen he had already uncapped, as if the decision had been made before he walked through my door. He placed the papers on the kitchen table and pushed them toward me with a quick smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said they were simple updates for my medical benefits. Nothing complicated, nothing worth reading slowly. His tone was too quick, too light, like he was trying to slip something past me before I could look closely. I told him I wanted to take a moment, and he hesitated just long enough for the pause to feel wrong. He tried to brush off my concern, saying the forms were standard and only required a signature to keep everything active. The explanation felt thin, stretched over whatever intention sat beneath it. I picked up the first page and scanned it, recognizing none of the terms he claimed were medical. He leaned over my shoulder, pointing at a line he said confirmed coverage, but the wording didn't match anything I had seen before. When I told him I needed time, he pulled back with a tight smile, saying he would leave them with me just in case. Later that evening, while sorting through the mail on the counter, I found an envelope already sliced open, its flap pressed down unevenly, as if someone had tried to reseal it in a hurry. It was addressed to me, and the contents listed account changes I hadn't requested. I stood there for a long moment, weighing the possibility that I had forgotten opening it. But the cut was too clean, too straight, nothing like the way my hands fumble with envelopes. I slid the pages back inside and placed it aside, feeling a faint pressure settle across my shoulders. A day later, my nephew returned and mentioned the paperwork again, only this time he said it involved property adjustments, not medical benefit. He spoke casually, as if he hadn't used a different explanation the first time. The shift was subtle, but it opened something in my mind, a space where suspicion replaced trust. I asked him gently what exactly the papers were for. His expression froze for a second, just long enough to reveal he hadn't expected the question. He changed his tone, softened it, and told me not to worry, saying it was simply housekeeping. While he spoke, I excused myself and went to my desk drawer where I kept old documents. Inside, tucked between receipts, I found a photocopy of my signature on a form I knew I had never seen before. The copy was crooked, the signature slightly slanted, the lines not matching my natural handwriting. Someone had taken a genuine signature of mine and tried to place it on a page where it didn't belong. My breath slowed, not from panic, but from the clarity that washed through me. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't confusion. It was intentional. When I returned to the living room, my nephew had changed completely. His voice was softer, his posture more relaxed, offering to tidy up the kitchen or run errands I hadn't asked for. He hovered in a way he never had before, too attentive, too careful. It was the behavior of someone trying to smooth over cracks he feared I had noticed. Each gesture was polished, practiced, as if he had rehearsed how to appear helpful. I listened to him talk, letting his words wash over me, without absorbing them. There was no accusation in my tone, no mention of the envelope or the signature. I simply nodded at the right moments, studying the new politeness he wore like a borrowed coat. It didn't fit him, not naturally. The room felt different now, not because of anything loud or dramatic, but because the ground beneath our relationship had shifted. Something hidden had surfaced, and though he didn't realize it, the distance between us grew with every overly gentle word he spoke. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, studying each line with the steady patience I once used at work. The wording felt too broad, the margins too wide, the layout slightly unbalanced. Small imperfections, but noticeable once I looked closely. I wrote down the reference number printed at the top and the name of the supposed witness, then folded the note and placed it in my pocket. I didn't feel panicked, it just sharpened, as if a fog had lifted and left everything colder. I called the issuing office after breakfast, speaking to the clerk in a calm, steady tone. I gave her the reference number and waited as she typed, listening to the faint tapping through the receiver. Her silence stretched longer than expected before she finally said there was no such form connected to my name. She repeated the search using variations of my information, even checking recently submitted paperwork. Each attempt returned nothing. She apologized for the inconvenience, but her confusion told me the problem wasn't with her system. It was with the papers in my hands. Before hanging up, I asked her to look up the name listed as the witness. The clerk checked quickly, scrolling through her records with clear efficiency. After a moment, she said the name didn't appear in any staff list, contractor list, volunteer record, or external directory they worked with. She didn't say anything more, but the slight shift in her voice carried a quiet message. Something about those documents was not legitimate. I thanked her and ended the call, sitting back in my chair as the weight of her answer settled firmly around me. With the phone still warm in my hand, I unfolded the paperwork again and examined it with new eyes. The header was slightly blurred, like it had been copied from a low-quality scan. The seal looked faint, lacking the depth and impression genuine stamps usually have. The signature line was misaligned by a few millimeters, and the witness block used a different font size altogether. These weren't mistakes an office would make. They were mistakes someone without training might miss. The realization brought no anger, just the cold clarity of understanding that the forms were imitations, not documents. Later in the afternoon, my nephew dropped by, letting himself in with a confidence that now felt out of place. He asked casually whether I had looked over the papers, keeping his tone light. I told him I had made a few calls to understand them better. His reaction was immediate, though he tried to hide it. A slight hitch in his breath, a pause before he asked which office I had called. His question came too quickly, the edges too sharp. He tried to soften it with a laugh, saying he only wanted to make sure I talked to the right department. I gave him a simple answer without offering any details. His shoulders tightened before he forced them to relax. He shifted the conversation to something harmless, talking about groceries and the weather, but his eyes moved restlessly around the room, as if scanning for something he had forgotten to hide. He didn't mention the paperwork again, not directly, but the polite calm he wore earlier had thinned. Underneath it was a tension he couldn't mask, an awareness that I had stepped outside the boundaries he had set for me. I listened to him talk while the pages sat folded on the counter behind me, their false structure exposed by the smallest details. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was a quiet resolve, a need to know exactly how deep this trail of fabrications went. His reaction had confirmed something the paperwork alone could not. Whatever he was building, he hadn't expected me to check. I took the papers to a retired paralegal I knew from years back, someone who had always spoken plainly and never dressed trouble in soft language. She read the first page slowly, then the second, her expression tightening with each line. When she reached the signature block, she stopped, tapped her finger against the text, and told me in a flat voice that the forms weren't medical at all. They were written to hand full legal control of my property to whoever submitted them. She didn't explain further, and she didn't need to. The meaning settled across my chest with a steady, unwelcome weight. When I returned home, I checked my desk drawer with a sharper eye than before. Several bank envelopes were missing, the ones usually placed in the same neat pile each month. I opened my email and found alerts I hadn't seen earlier, attempted logins, flagged activity, and access requests made from locations I didn't recognize. The messages were spaced out over several days, each one small enough to overlook but pointed enough to form a pattern. None of them belonged to me. I scrolled through them slowly, letting the truth build without rushing to counter it. Later that afternoon, while I stood by the mailbox trying to collect my thoughts, my neighbor from across the street called out to me. He's the observant type, quiet but attentive, someone who notices the rhythm of a neighborhood. He mentioned seeing my nephew taking mail from my box earlier in the week, saying he figured it was just to save me the walk. His tone was casual, but the detail hit harder than he realized. I thanked him without letting anything show, keeping my voice steady while something inside me shifted into a sharper, colder place. Back inside, I checked the mail pile again. A few envelopes had been opened and resealed with uneven lines of glue. One from the bank had a faint crease across the seal, like someone had folded it before closing it again. Another came from an insurance office and held notes in handwriting that wasn't mine, small marks next to sections discussing account oversight and beneficiary access. The more I looked, the more obvious it became that someone had gone through my mail with a purpose that had nothing to do with helping me. I sat down with the folder containing the forged documents and reviewed the rejection notice I had overlooked the previous week. It came from a state processing center, stating the submission had been denied due to incomplete verification. The form attached listed a power of attorney request, not in my handwriting, not in my words, but bearing a clumsy attempt at my signature. Only then did I notice the date. It aligned with the same afternoon my nephew had stopped by, just to check in. There was no sense of misunderstanding left. The pattern had become a structure. This wasn't a mistake or an overreach. It was a coordinated attempt to take control of everything tied to my name. The paperwork, the mail, the bank attempts. They weren't isolated. They were steps in a plan that relied on me being too slow, too trusting, or too tired to see the connections. For months, he had positioned himself as the helpful relative, easing his way into my routines, learning the rhythm of my days, taking advantage of the quiet grief that lived inside the house. I looked around the room, taking in the ordinary objects that had once made me feel safe. My chair, my desk, the framed photos on the wall. They hadn't changed, but the meaning around them had. The space I thought was my refuge had become the place where someone else mapped out the limits of my independence. I wasn't confused or panicked. I was awake. And for the first time, I understood that my nephew wasn't trying to help me navigate old age. He was trying to own it. The elder law attorney's office sat on the second floor of a quiet brick building, the kind of place where the air always felt slightly cooler and the lights remained steady without a flicker. I arrived early, carrying the folder of papers under my arm, gripping it tighter each time I thought about what was inside. The receptionist led me to a small conference room where the attorney waited, a composed man in his late 50s, with the calm posture of someone who had seen more schemes than most people could imagine. He greeted me with a firm handshake, then motioned for me to sit across from him. I handed him the forged documents without saying much. His eyes moved over the pages in a slow, deliberate scan, pausing at the signature, the witness box, the formatted lines that pretended to be official. He didn't interrupt himself with questions or commentary. He simply turned each page with the precision of someone used to uncovering lies that arrived dressed as paperwork. When he finally placed the stack down, he tapped the top sheet once and looked at me with a steady, grounded seriousness. "These would strip you of your rights," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If you had signed them, your nephew would gain full control over your property and financial decisions." The words didn't need embellishment. The truth sat heavy between us, undeniable and cold. I didn't flinch. but I felt the weight settle deeper into my chest, confirming what the earlier warnings had only suggested. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as he explained how documents like these are often used. He described cases where seniors were pressured during vulnerable periods, handed forms disguised as harmless updates, and manipulated into believing someone was acting in their best interest. He talked about isolation, about how grief, illness, or loneliness opened space for others to step in quietly. His tone never shifted into drama. He spoke like a surgeon describing a familiar procedure, each detail revealing how predictable the tactic really was. He pointed to the signature line again, noting the mismatched strokes, the unnatural slant. Then he showed me the altered formatting, fonts that didn't match state templates, misplaced margins, and seal imitations often used by people who don't expect close inspection. None of it was accidental. None of it came from an official source. He told me the pattern in my documents matched attempts he had seen from relatives who wanted quick access to assets without waiting for natural transitions. When I asked what would have happened if I had signed, he answered plainly, my accounts, property, and decisions could have been taken over without further consent. My role would have shifted from independent adult to dependent subject, controlled completely by the person listed on the form. It wasn't fear that settled in me. It was clarity, sharp enough to cut through any remaining doubt about my nephew's intentions. The attorney leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. He's preparing to take over your decisions, he said, not as a warning, but as a fact already in motion. You need to protect yourself, and you need to do it quietly. People who get this far usually move faster once they sense resistance. He outlined immediate precautions: securing my accounts, locking down my records, removing stray documents from my home, and avoiding any signatures until each form was reviewed directly in his office. He advised me not to confront my nephew yet, explaining that sudden exposure often makes people reckless. Instead, he urged me to build a protective wall around every part of my life he could reach. When I left the office, the afternoon light felt colder than the morning air. I held the folder tightly, no longer confused and no longer hesitant. The line I had been inching toward was now behind me. Whatever happened next, I couldn't step back into the quiet trust that once existed. I had crossed into a place where I needed to move carefully or lose everything. I spent the next morning moving through the house with a quiet focus, opening drawers I hadn't checked in months and sorting through folders that suddenly mattered more than I ever realized. Every envelope that looked tampered with went into one pile, every document with odd marks into another. I moved slowly, not out of weakness, but out of caution, taking the time to recognize which papers had been touched and which had been left alone. By noon, I had gathered a full box: bank notices, altered mail, photocopied signatures, and the forged forms that had started the entire unraveling. At the attorney's office, he spread the contents across the table with professional precision, lining each page at perfect angles. He examined them one by one, sorting them into categories I couldn't name but immediately understood the importance of. He created a counterfile thicker than anything my nephew had put together, each piece labeled with dates and notes that built a timeline of manipulation. There was no emotion in how he worked, only structure, logic, and the quiet certainty of someone building a shield. When he finished, he handed me copies and told me to keep them somewhere no one else could reach. Back at home, my nephew knocked on the door with a false cheerfulness that didn't travel past his voice. He asked if I had reviewed the forms yet, and when I said I was still thinking, something sharp flickered across his expression. It wasn't anger, not loud or visible, but something smaller, a tightening around the eyes, a stiffness in the jaw. He tried to hide it by asking about lunch, offering to pick something, but the impatience beneath his words made each sentence land unevenly. He lingered longer than necessary, glancing around the room as if searching for something he expected to see. Over the next few days, his behavior shifted in subtle ways. He arrived unannounced more frequently, letting himself into the house before I reached the door. He asked questions in rapid succession, whether I needed help with errands, whether I had sorted my mail, whether I had spoken to anyone about the papers. He watched me closely when I answered, studying my tone more than my words. At one point, he stood behind me while I arranged the newspaper, his presence too close, too deliberate. Small moments, each one carrying attention that didn't belong in family interactions. I didn't respond with suspicion or confrontation. I kept my voice level, my movement steady, my expression calm enough to give him nothing to read. Letting him believe I was still uncertain gave me room to move without drawing attention. Each time he left the house, I used the quiet to check the doors, the windows, and the places where I kept important papers. His growing impatience made the air feel heavier inside the walls, like the house itself was bracing for something it hadn't seen before. Late one evening, after he had stopped by for the second time that day, I sat at my old desk and picked up the phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years, belonging to a friend I trusted more than anyone, an old officer who had retired with his integrity intact. He answered with the same steady tone he used when we were younger, and I told him only what he needed to hear. There were documents, there were attempts to access my accounts, and I needed guidance. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't doubt. He told me he'd come by the next morning. His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had seen how far people can go when no one stops them. When I hung up, the house felt still, but not empty. The decisions ahead of me were clear now, fast, dramatic, not emotional, but necessary. The calm before a fight isn't loud. It's the moment a man decides he won't be pushed any further. He showed up earlier than usual, knocking only once before stepping inside with a confidence that didn't match the tension in his eyes. He said he needed to drive me to an office downtown, claiming they were waiting for my signature and the deadline couldn't be missed. I told him I wasn't going anywhere without knowing why, but he insisted, guiding me toward the door with a hand on my arm that felt less like support and more like pressure. His voice stayed calm, but the urgency beneath it left me without any room to argue, without exposing what I had learned. I followed him to the car, watching the road ahead with a steady quiet. He parked several blocks from the supposed office, near a crowded intersection where people moved quickly between shops and buses. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out another stack of papers, freshly printed, with a pen clipped to the top. He thrust them toward me and said, "We need to do this now." His tone was sharp, stripped of the polite softness he'd used for months. The confidence he pushed into the words felt rehearsed, but the tremor in his hand told a different story. Before I could respond, he opened my door and guided me out, positioning us against a wall where foot traffic was heavy but fast-moving. He pointed at the signature line again, pressing the pen into my palm. I looked at the page and saw the same structure as before. Control transferred, authority removed. My name placed neatly inside a trap built from familiar handwriting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. His breathing quickened as he urged me again, insisting it was routine and harmless. A man walking past slowed down, his eyes flicking between the papers and my nephew's tight grip on my arm. He hesitated, then stepped closer, asking if everything was all right. My nephew stiffened, offering an overly bright explanation about helping his uncle with forms. The stranger didn't respond. He looked directly at me and asked if I wanted him to stay. I nodded once. That was enough for him to pull his phone from his pocket and step to the side. My nephew snapped at him to mind his business, but the stranger had already dialed. 2 officers arrived minutes later, their calm approach sinking a deeper silence into the space around us. They separated us without raising their voices, one guiding me aside while the other asked my nephew to step back. I handed over the folder I had brought in my jacket, the copies my lawyer had prepared, the mail with altered seals, the rejection notice for the forged power of attorney. I explained in simple, steady sentences how the documents had appeared, how the signatures didn't belong to me, and how account access had been attempted without my permission. The officers listened without interruption, their eyes scanning the pages with a focus that matched the seriousness of the situation. My nephew tried to interrupt, insisting I was confused, saying he was just trying to help with paperwork I didn't understand. But his words tumbled out too quickly, overlapping, contradicting themselves. One officer asked where the original forms came from, and he hesitated, just long enough to betray himself. When pressed again, he offered a different explanation entirely. Then another, the shifting stories stacking against him. The tension in his voice rose, his composure slipping like someone grabbing at a rope with fraying ends. The officers exchanged a glance that carried more meaning than anything said so far. They asked him to step toward the car while they verified the documents. He tried to protest, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, But the panic breaking through his voice cut away any remaining doubt. He wasn't calm. He wasn't confident. He was cornered. I stood quietly, watching the officers speak with him, their questions steady and precise. The truth had been sitting in plain sight for weeks, but now it was exposed under the weight of real authority. He didn't look back at me when they led him aside. There was no apology, no explanation, only the sharp collapse of a plan unraveling in public, under the eyes of strangers who saw more clearly than he ever expected. The officers placed my nephew in the back of the patrol car with practiced ease, their movements calm and controlled as they secured the door behind him. There was no shouting, no struggle, just the quiet procedural steps of people who knew exactly what they were dealing with. He stared straight ahead, refusing to meet my eyes, his jaw locked in a rigid line that held more fear than anger. Watching him there, I felt no satisfaction, only the heavy truth of what had been unfolding behind my back for months. At the station, they guided me to a small interview room with white walls and a metal table that reflected a muted glow under the overhead light. My elder law attorney arrived shortly after, carrying the same file he had built so carefully. He greeted me with a firm nod, then sat beside me as the officers began taking my statement. His presence kept the process steady, grounding each detail in facts rather than emotion. When the retired officer, my old friend, entered the room, he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder before pulling up a chair. He said nothing unnecessary. He didn't need to. The investigators asked clear, direct questions, each one cutting through the fog my nephew had hoped would hide his intentions. I explained the forged documents, the tampered mail, the access attempts on my accounts, and the pressured signing attempts. My attorney slid each piece of evidence forward at the right moment, his voice low but firm, helping me outline the pattern without drifting into speculation. The officers listened carefully, taking notes with the steady rhythm of people who understood the seriousness of what stood before them. Then the financial investigator arrived, a woman with sharp eyes and a quiet, analytical presence. She reviewed the documents, flipping through pages with precise movements. She traced dates, signatures, login times, and rejected forms, building a timeline that aligned perfectly with the behavior I had described. When she reached the forged power of attorney attempt, her expression hardened just slightly. She pointed out the inconsistencies and confirmed that several attempts had been made to access my accounts using information that shouldn't have been available to anyone else. Her analysis was factual, free of judgment, but every word made the truth louder. By late afternoon, the officers informed us that my nephew would be held for elder exploitation attempts, forgery, and unauthorized access to private accounts. The charges were explained without drama, each one delivered in the same steady tone. There was no debate, no alternate explanation left standing. The evidence had spoken, piece by piece, until the full picture was undeniable. Once the statements were completed, my attorney guided me through the steps to restore control over every part of my life. We contacted my bank, my insurance provider, and the agencies connected to my record. Passwords were changed, accounts secured, and fraudulent inquiries flagged. A protective order was initiated, ensuring my nephew could not approach me or access anything tied to my name. By the end of the process, the parts of my life he had tried to stretch into his control were firmly back in my hands. When I returned home that evening, the house felt quiet, but not in the same way it had after my wife passed. This silence carried its own weight, an understanding of how close I had come to losing everything without a single blow being thrown. I sat down in the living room, looking at the framed photos on the shelf. My nephew's face appeared in several of them, smiling at moments I once thought were sincere. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. Just a deep, steady ache that settled into the corners of the room. Raising him had been a choice made from love, not obligation. Trusting him had been natural, something I never thought I'd question. Losing that trust wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and final. Some betrayals don't break you all at once. They hollow you out piece by piece until you finally see what's missing. In the weeks after the investigation, I moved through each day with the steady intention of someone rebuilding the edges of his life. My attorney helped finalize the permanent protections we had discussed, documents that locked my decisions behind clear requirements, signatures only I could provide, and safeguards no one could bypass. We filed them quietly, without ceremony, ensuring every record, every account, and every authorization had my hand on it alone. When the clerk stamped the last form, the sound wasn't triumphant. It was simply final, a seal on a chapter that needed to close with precision rather than emotion. At home, I went through my drawers with a sharper eye than before. Papers were reorganized, duplicated, and stored in places only I knew. I placed important documents inside a fireproof lockbox, then added a second box in a different room. My passwords were written down in a coded system I could understand, but no one else could guess. None of these actions felt paranoid. They felt reasonable, practical steps a man should have taken long before trust blurred the lines of caution. Each small task tightened the boundaries that had once been left too open. When the house grew quiet in the evenings, I found myself thinking about how easily silence can turn into vulnerability. It wasn't the loud moments that created danger. It was the quiet ones. The days when I let someone else bring in the mail. The times I nodded along without reading what was put in front of me. The evenings when I accepted help without asking questions. I hadn't been careless. I had been grieving. And grief narrows your sight in ways you don't notice until someone else is using the darkness to rearrange your life. Trusting my nephew had felt natural. He was family. Someone I'd watched grow from a boy into a young man. I assumed his presence in my home came from care, not calculation. That assumption became the crack he stepped through, widening it each time I stayed silent instead of questioning the small things. I learned the hard way that silence isn't safety. It's an opening. And people with the wrong intentions recognize those openings faster than the person who creates them. As the days settled into a calmer rhythm, I began noting small pieces of advice in a notebook. Not for anyone in particular, but for anyone who might need them someday. I wrote down reminders. Check every envelope. Verify every call. Question every signature. Don't hand over mail. Don't let anyone rush a decision. Make sure every document, no matter how routine it appears, gets read with clear eyes and a steady mind. These weren't rules born of bitterness. They were simple truths carved from what nearly happened. I returned to my routines with a new steadiness. Morning walks became longer. I cooked my own meals instead of relying on someone else to pick things up for me. I repaired a loose hinge on the back door, fixed a flickering light in the hallway, and cleared out the closet I had avoided for too long. Every completed task gave me a piece of myself back. Not the part that trusted blindly, but the part that understood independence wasn't just a word. It was a practice. In the quiet hours before bed, I didn't revisit the memories of my nephew sitting at my table, smiling in a way I once thought was honest. I didn't try to make sense of his choices or trace where things had gone wrong. Some answers don't heal anything. They only reopen doors that need to stay closed. What mattered now wasn't the past, but the boundary I had rebuilt. Firm, clear, and mine alone. I moved through the house with a confidence that came from clarity, not comfort. The world hadn't changed, but my understanding of it had sharpened. Age doesn't weaken a man. The wrong trust does. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong person is.